2023 was full of change, for better and for worse. And as we get ready to put another year of stories behind us, let's look back at some of the most important ones from the past 12 months. We'll begin in the depths of the North Atlantic. Prior to June 18th, most people had never heard of OceanGate, but the private tourism and expeditions company found itself in the global spotlight when the Titan, a 22-foot submersible, was lost on its way to the wreck of the Titanic off the coast of Newfoundland. The Titan departed St. John's with 5 people on board, including a 19-year-old. Search teams from the Canadian Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Navy were deployed to the Atlantic, working against the clock as the company estimated that the Titan would have only 4 days worth of oxygen. 3 days passed, and as people watched and waited and speculated over the crew's fates, information began to come out about OceanGate's safety record. The company operated in international waters to avoid safety regulations. They'd been unwilling to pay to have vessels certified, and its CEO was a self-styled daredevil. And a debate began over the appropriateness of using taxpayer-funded search teams to rescue those who had knowingly flaunted safety standards in the pursuit of adventure. But most conversation revolved around what happened to the crew. That was answered on June 22nd, when a debris field was located near the wreck of the Titanic.
The debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber.
A report from the U.S. Coast Guard found that the vessel had most likely imploded due to extreme pressure of the depths, with all 5 on board having been killed instantly. A tragic end to a story that gripped the world for a week in June. So while strikes brought Hollywood to a halt on our side of the border, picket lines were long and almost ever present in 2023. Hundreds of thousands of workers walked off the job for a series of high-profile strikes this year.
What do we want? We want it now!
For more than 100,000 federal public sector employees, they went on strike in April after negotiations between the Public Service Alliance of Canada and Ottawa over wage increases failed. Now that strike, which disrupted an array of services from the management of prisons to the processing of passports and tax returns, that lasted 12 days, producing a new deal for the union. Also walking off the job this year were public service workers in Quebec, BC port workers, school support staff in Nova Scotia, grocery employees, and more. And although the actual number of strikes was down this year compared to previous years, the average length of those strikes was longer than it had been since 2017. And the number of workdays missed due to strikes was the highest in nearly 2 decades. The average wage increase negotiated in settlements is also up. It's about 3.7% higher than the 2.5% from last year. Promising signs, experts say, for Canada's labor strength, which had been in decline for some time. The world watched as Canada burned in 2023. It was by far the most devastating wildfire season on record, with more than 18 million hectares lost to flames, more than doubling the previous record, 7.5 million. And it wasn't just about how many fires burned, but where they burned. BC was once again the province with the most recorded fires, but it was Quebec where the most hectares were lost, more than 5 million of them. Alberta, the territories, all of Atlantic Canada, nowhere in this country was spared. The damage was almost immeasurable. Lives were lost, homes destroyed, entire communities decimated.
It's a pretty gut-wrenching feeling, walking around the turn to see your place. It's no longer there.
And I had stuff from high school, my yearbooks, pictures, notes from friends and stuff, and that's all gone too.
The fires in Ontario and Quebec produced a thick smoke that blanketed both provinces and the northeastern United States. And it wasn't just the fires. Atlantic Canada saw its 4th most active hurricane season ever, with 20 recorded storms. Flash floods in Nova Scotia claimed 4 lives in July after areas in the province received 254 millimeters of rain in the span of just 24 hours. A summer storm in Quebec saw the streets flooded, hundreds of thousands of people lost power, and an estimated $200 million in damage was incurred, all serving as grim reminders of the dangers of a changing climate. Our next story, war in the Middle East. On October 7th, a barrage of rockets were fired from Palestine into Israel, aimed at major cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Shortly after, members of the Hamas militant group rushed across the border, many on motorcycles, attacking Israelis at random. Israeli media say more than 1,000 were killed and hundreds more were taken back across the border as hostages. Israel subsequently declared itself at war. Its allies, Canada among them, swiftly condemned Hamas's actions as an act of terrorism.
Hamas terrorists aren't a resistance. They're not freedom fighters. They are terrorists.
What immediately followed was a relentless offensive on the Gaza Strip, through the air and on the ground, and in the months since that offensive has only intensified. Meanwhile, life in Gaza has quickly spiraled into a humanitarian crisis. Israel has been accused of blocking aid into the Strip, drawing condemnation from the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Even the United States, Israel's most staunch defender, urged both sides to pause the fighting and allow for the delivery of food, fuel, and other aid. The health ministry in Gaza says more than 18,000 Palestinians have been killed, and 85% of those living in Gaza have been driven from their homes. Some have been allowed to cross safely into Egypt, but millions remain. And even though 153 nations, including Canada, voted in favor of a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire, there appears to be no end to the war in sight. Israel's defense minister said weeks ago that the ground offensive against Hamas will, quote, take time. And finally, something that has affected most all of us this year, affordability. From homes to food to, well, pretty much everything. Life has become increasingly expensive for Canadians in 2023. While overall inflation has eased back around 3%, food inflation still sits at about 6%. The resulting hardship has forced more Canadians than ever to rely on food banks and launched a parliamentary investigation into the food industry, with politicians demanding action from grocers. And while housing prices aren't rising exponentially like they had been, they haven't gone down. The average sale price across Canada still about 2% higher than it was last year. That's despite the decline in earning power. The average home in Canada is selling for just over $650,000, with a 20% down payment being $131,000. So if you want a place in a city like Toronto, you're looking to nearly double that. Household debt held around 180%, meaning for every dollar earned, the average Canadian has $1.80 in debt. The Bank of Canada, meanwhile, is aiming to achieve its goal of receiving 2% inflation through interest rate decisions. It has hiked the overnight rate 3 times this year, now sitting at 5%. But for the average Canadian, making ends meet is perhaps more challenging than it has been in recent memory. Thank you all for watching all of these stories and more unfold with us for this past year. We will be here for whatever 2024 may bring.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.